Hey, Cross, those scars from losing a fight with a toolbox? Or did your pen explode on you? The laughter from the young privates echoed across the hangar, cruel and eager. But Lieutenant Natalie Cross didn't flinch. She didn't even look their way. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on the checklist in her hands, her scarred forearms moving with quiet precision, as if their words hadn't even touched her. Then everything changed. The laughter stopped the moment General Bradford walked in. A man who'd led thousands into battle, his boots barely echoed before he froze at the sight of Cross. And then, in a silence thick enough to choke on, he saluted her first. That's when Ward realized. He'd mocked a legend hidden in plain sight. Ravenfield Air Base woke with the dawn like it always did, with a hum that built slowly into the roar of another day. The scent of jet fuel hung in the air like a ghost of yesterday's sorties, mixing with the tang of hydraulic fluid and scorched metal. Inside the cavernous maintenance bay, the echoes of voices, the clatter of tools, and the low thrum of idling engines created a symphony of organized chaos. Sunlight filtered in through high, grimy windows, casting long beams across the polished concrete floors, streaked with oil and dust. Technicians called to one another across the expanse, voices raised to be heard over the hiss of air compressors and the bark of orders. It was the kind of place where everything had a purpose. Every sound, every smell, every scar on the walls or floor told a story of missions flown, repairs made, and battles prepared for. And within this rhythm, moving as seamlessly as the machinery around her, was Lieutenant Natalie Cross. She didn't rush, didn't dawdle. Her pace was measured, deliberate. Clipboard in hand, she moved between aircraft like a conductor of this mechanical orchestra. Her dark hair was pulled tight at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place, her uniform as precise as the lines on her checklist. But it was her forearms that drew the eye, or would have, if those around her weren't too disciplined, too respectful, or too oblivious to stare. Jagged scars like lightning frozen in flesh mapped their way from wrist to elbow, stark against her skin. The new recruits noticed. Of course they did. They always did. But Natalie didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Her focus was absolute, her expression calm, as if their curiosity or whispered comments were beneath her notice. There was a gravity to her, a presence that didn't shout or command, but filled the space nonetheless. The seasoned NCOs saw it, even if the fresh privates didn't. They understood the quiet authority in the way she moved, the certainty in her eyes when she double-checked a torque reading or signed off on a completed system test. Cross wasn't the kind of officer who barked orders or demanded respect. She didn't have to. The old hands, us men and women who'd spent decades turning wrenches and keeping aircraft aloft, gave it to her without being asked. A nod here, a brief meeting of eyes there, silent acknowledgments that passed between them like a language the young ones hadn't learned yet. But the scars told a story of their own. And too often, people mistook that story. Fresh out of tech school, eager to prove themselves, the young ones like Ward and his friends looked at her and saw what they wanted to see. Maybe a cautionary tale, maybe a victim, maybe just someone different enough to target with a cheap joke. But scars don't always mean weakness. Sometimes they're the map of survival. The evidence that someone walked through fire and made it out the other side. Sometimes the ones with the scars are the ones you should watch and wonder about and learn from. Natalie Cross didn't need to explain that. She didn't wear those marks as a badge or a shield or a weapon. They were just a part of her, like the steady hands that signed off the logs, or the sharp mind that could spot a miscalibrated sensor at a glance. From time to time, a young airman or new recruit would glance her way, and a veteran sergeant would follow that glance with a look of their own, one that said, "Think twice," and more often than not, that was enough. The ones who'd been around understood that Cross had earned her place here, and that the ghosts of the maintenance bay weren't just the echoes of engines and the smell of fuel. Sometimes the ghosts were flesh and blood, walking among them quietly, doing the work, and asking for no more respect than they'd earned, but no less either. And so, the rhythm of Ravenfield Air Base continued, the hum and roar of duty woven through the morning air. And Lieutenant Natalie Cross moved through it all, steady as the rising sun, unseen by those too young or too foolish to look past what they thought they saw, but deeply known by those who mattered. Ethan Ward had always been the top of his class. At least that's what he told himself when he lay awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his shared barracks room. From the moment he'd enlisted, he'd excelled at the written tests, outperformed his peers in physical drills, and memorized regulations as if his life depended on it. On paper, he was everything a commanding officer could hope for: sharp, driven, confident. But paper didn't show what happened when the lights went out. It didn't show the gnawing doubt that chewed at him when he saw the seasoned techs work on an engine like it was an extension of their own hands. It didn't show the fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as good as he thought. Or worse, that everyone would find out. So Ethan did what a lot of young soldiers do when they're terrified of being seen for what they are. He put on a show. From day one at Ravenfield Air Base, he made sure his voice was the loudest in the room. Quick with a joke, quicker with a jab, anything to keep the spotlight where he could control it. And when he saw someone who didn't fit the mold, someone like Lieutenant Cross with her quiet ways and her scarred arms, well, that was easy. Easier than admitting that she unsettled him. Easier than asking himself why the veteran NCOs gave her those small, respectful nods when they thought no one was watching. In Ethan's mind, Natalie Cross was an anomaly, and anomalies were threats. He couldn't define what made him nervous about her, so he turned it into mockery. If he could get his buddies to laugh, then maybe he could drown out that small voice in the back of his mind whispering, "She's not what you think, and you're not as sharp as you pretend to be. Hey, Cross, those scars from losing a fight with a toolbox? Or did your pen explode on you?" He'd thrown the line out with a grin, feeling the familiar rush as the other privates laughed on cue. The laughter was what he craved. Not because he disliked Cross, not really, but because for that moment, the attention was on someone else. Someone who, in his mind, couldn't fight back. Someone whose silence he mistook for weakness. Inside, though, Ethan knew better. Somewhere deep down, he felt the weight of every glance the NCOs exchanged behind his back. He noticed in flashes the way their respect for Cross wasn't forced, wasn't for show. And that scared him more than he could say. Because if she had earned that kind of respect without demanding it, then what did that make him? The one who demanded it with every loud laugh, every clever jab. Arrogance was his armor, mockery, his shield. It was easier to tear down what he didn't understand than to admit his own insecurities. Easier to judge what was visible, the scars, than to face the invisible battles he hadn't fought yet, the ones inside himself. And the truth was, Ethan Ward wasn't alone. There were dozens, hundreds like him in uniform, young men and women terrified of not measuring up, terrified of being found wanting, so they filled the silence with noise. They mistook volume for strength. They mistook judgment for confidence. When Natalie didn't respond to his barbs, it rattled him. He didn't realize it then, but her silence was the loudest answer she could have given. Every word he threw her way bounced harmlessly off that wall of quiet strength. And the more she didn't react, the more he felt the cracks in his own facade widen. In the safety of his bunk at night, Ethan would think about that. About how her steady gaze, when she did look his way, seemed to see right through him. About how her scars, the ones he mocked, weren't marks of shame but proof that she'd been through something he couldn't begin to understand. But in the daylight, in the hangar, surrounded by peers eager to laugh, he chose the easy path. The path of arrogance. The path that hid the fear gnawing at him. Because admitting the truth, that Natalie Cross intimidated him, not with her words but with her calm, her competence, her quiet dignity, that was too much for him to face. At least not yet. The morning heat had begun to creep into the maintenance bay, making the smell of oil, metal, and jet fuel even heavier. The usual rhythm of work continued. Tools clattered, instructions barked, and the whine of engines in testing rose and fell like a distant storm. Ethan Ward, feeling triumphant after another jab at Lieutenant Cross, leaned against a crate with a smirk still tugging at the corner of his mouth. His buddies were watching him, waiting for his next performance. Natalie Cross, as always, was unfazed. She moved with precision, marking off items on her checklist, double-checking inventory, and confirming reports with quiet nods to the NCOs, who treated her with a deference that still irritated Ethan for reasons he couldn't admit to himself. And then the air shifted. It started small. The way conversations near the bay doors suddenly lowered to murmurs, then stopped altogether. The sound of boots on concrete echoed in the space where moments earlier there had been chatter and laughter. The technicians near the entrance snapped to attention, their spines straightening as if pulled by an invisible string. Ethan turned, annoyed at first that his audience's attention had been stolen, but then he saw him, General Bradford. The man didn't need introduction. His very presence filled the bay like a thundercloud. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dust of the base. His chest was heavy with ribbons and stars, too many for Ethan to count in the moment. The general's face was weathered, lined from years of decisions made in war rooms and on battlefields. Every eye followed Bradford as he strode in, his gaze sweeping over the bay like a commander surveying a battlefield. The weight of his rank seemed to press down on the room itself. Conversations died, movements stilled. Even the hum of the machinery seemed quieter, as if the base itself recognized authority when it walked in. Ethan snapped to attention, heart pounding. He had seen generals before, during training and ceremonies, but never like this. Never up close, never here in the heart of the base, where the real work was done. Bradford's boots echoed with each step as he advanced. Not hurried, but purposeful, as if every stride had a destination. His eyes moved over the young recruits, the senior NCOs, the aircraft, the machinery, until they found Natalie Cross. And then everything changed. The general stopped dead in his tracks. His face, stern, composed, shifted for just a fraction of a second. His eyes widened, then softened, as recognition lit them from within. The room, already silent, seemed to hold its breath. And then, in a silence thick enough to choke on, General Bradford did what no one expected. He raised his hand and saluted her. Not a casual nod, not the kind of quick acknowledgement a general might give a junior officer out of courtesy. A full, formal salute, crisp, precise, and offered with the respect of one soldier to another who had earned it in the fires of combat. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach twisted as the weight of what he was seeing sank in. His mind scrambled for some explanation. A general, a four-star general, saluting a lieutenant first? It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. Protocol dictated otherwise. Rank dictated otherwise. But there it was. Natalie Cross hesitated, as if the gesture surprised even her. Then quietly she returned the salute, her movements as clean and measured as ever. For a heartbeat, the bay was frozen in time. The general and the lieutenant, saluting each other, bound by something no one else could see or understand. And then Bradford broke the moment, his voice low but carrying. "It's been a long time, Ghosthawk." The nickname hit the room like a shockwave. Officers stiffened. Senior NCOs glanced at one another, expressions of recognition, of disbelief, of awe passing between them. The younger recruits, Ethan included, stood dumbstruck, understanding only that they were witnessing something far beyond their pay grade. Ghosthawk. The name wasn't in the manuals. It wasn't something you heard in formal briefings. It was whispered in corridors, mentioned in bars late at night. A call sign from a mission so classified, most believed it was just a story. Operation Iron Veil. The impossible op. The one no one was supposed to survive. The one that turned the tide in a conflict no one talked about on record. And the woman he'd mocked. The woman with the scars he'd laughed at. She was Ghosthawk. The legend wasn't some phantom in the files. She was standing right there, scarred arms at her sides, calm and composed, with eyes that had seen things Ethan could never imagine. In that instant, Ethan Ward felt something break inside him, the smug certainty, the cocky bravado. It all crumbled, leaving behind only shame and the cold realization that he had misjudged her in every possible way. The general lowered his hand, nodded once more, and moved on. But the room would never be the same, and neither would Ethan Ward. Ghosthawk. The name echoed through the maintenance bay like a forgotten hymn suddenly remembered. Those who'd served long enough felt the weight of it. The younger ones, like Ethan, felt only the shift in the air, the way the senior NCOs straightened, the way even officers hesitated before speaking again. But what did it mean? Ghosthawk wasn't just a call sign. It was a shadow that had loomed over late-night stories told in hushed voices. About a mission so classified most believed it had been buried, erased from the official history of the armed forces. Operation Iron Veil, and Natalie Cross had been at the heart of it. It was years before, in a region no map would label, during a conflict no politician would admit had happened. A coalition of hostiles had taken control of a vital energy grid deep behind enemy lines. Satellite images had shown hostages, engineers, aid workers, a handful of American advisors. The grid couldn't fall. The hostages couldn't be left to die. But any conventional rescue mission would have failed. The enemy had fortified the complex. Anti-aircraft batteries covered every approach, and the terrain was a nightmare of cliffs, canyons, and mined roads. They called it impossible. And then they called in Ghosthawk. Natalie Cross, then a captain, was chosen to lead a team so small it bordered on reckless. 8 operators, 8 souls tasked with doing what entire battalions couldn't. Their orders were simple on paper, impossible in practice: infiltrate, disable the grid, rescue the hostages, and vanish without leaving a trace. They moved at night under cover of storms that turned the mountain passes to mud and made drones useless. They scaled cliffs by hand, carrying only what they could bear. Cross led from the front, setting pace, charting routes, calling decisions that meant life or death. She was the one who saw the weak point in the defenses. She was the one who devised the silent takedown of the outer perimeter. They were ghosts, moving unseen through enemy territory, hearts pounding in unison, trusting Ghosthawk's voice in their ears to guide them. But it didn't go perfectly. How could it? The enemy was waiting, better prepared than anyone had guessed. The extraction point was ambushed. The grid was rigged to blow. Natalie made the call no one else could. She stayed behind with 2 others, buying time while the hostages and remaining team members fled through a secondary route. Minutes turned to hours. Explosions rocked the hills. A comms blackout left command blind, listening to static as they waited for news that wouldn't come. When the dust cleared, the grid was down, the hostages were safe, and Ghosthawk was gone, presumed dead. Another casualty in the war no one spoke of. Medals were written into citations no one would read. Ghosthawk became a legend, a ghost indeed, until today. Until she stood in the hangar at Ravenfield Air Base, clipboard in hand, a maintenance officer doing the quiet work of keeping jets aloft. The work no one noticed, the work no one celebrated. Ethan stood frozen, processing what he had just seen, what he now understood. The woman he had mocked, the scars he had joked about. They were the price of that mission, the price of courage he couldn't begin to fathom. And here she was, not parading her heroism, not demanding recognition, but working in the shadows, content to serve in silence. Real heroes don't need the spotlight. Natalie Cross had no use for it. Oh, she bore the weight of what she'd done and what it had cost in quiet dignity. The world didn't need to know. The medals that might have been pinned on her chest meant nothing to her now. What mattered was that the jets flew, the missions went on, and others lived because she had once chosen to stand in the fire. Ethan felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. His arrogance, his jokes, his need for attention, they were nothing beside the quiet strength of a woman who had walked through hell and returned, not seeking applause but simply another way to serve. Some burdens are invisible, some heroes too, and Natalie Cross was both. Ethan stood where the general had left him, his body stiff at attention long after Bradford had disappeared into the maze of the airbase. Around him, the bay began to breathe again. Voices rose in cautious conversation, tools clinked and whirred back to life, and the base's rhythm slowly resumed. But for Ethan, everything had changed. He felt hollow, as if all the bravado that had filled him moments ago had been sucked out, leaving only a raw, aching truth. Ghosthawk. The name echoed inside his head, louder than the laughter he'd once chased, louder than the cheers of his peers when his jokes had landed. The woman he'd mocked, belittled, turned into the punchline of a joke. She was a legend, and not a legend built on hype or self-promotion, a legend built on sacrifice, on doing the impossible. Ethan's stomach twisted with shame. He'd been so certain, so eager to impress, to be the one the others admired. And now he was the fool who had mocked what he didn't understand, the fool who had judged a hero by the marks she bore. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan went through the motions of his duties, his hands completing tasks on autopilot, while his mind replayed every word, every smirk, every slight he'd directed at Lieutenant Cross. He caught himself glancing at her as she moved through the bay, as steady and composed as always. She hadn't changed, but he had, and he saw her differently now. Late that afternoon, as the sun sank low and cast long shadows across the hangar, Ethan found himself outside leaning against the wall of the barracks, trying to quiet the storm inside him. Long day. The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Claiborne, a man who'd served longer than most of the base's officers had worn rank. His voice was low, gruff, but not unkind. Ethan hesitated before nodding. Yeah, long day. Claiborne stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the sun dip behind the distant hills. You're not the first young airman to eat a slice of humble pie, Claiborne said after a beat, and you won't be the last. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't want to know. I just thought if I made people laugh, I wouldn't have to think about what I didn't understand. Claiborne nodded as if he'd heard that confession 100 times before. That's the thing about arrogance, Ward. Most times it's just fear wearing a louder coat. The words hit Ethan hard, because they were true. He'd mocked because he'd been afraid that Natalie Cross's quiet strength made his own loudness look small. Afraid that he wasn't as sharp or capable as his test scores and certificates claimed. She doesn't act like she's anything special, Ethan said, more to himself than to Claiborne. Because she doesn't need to, Claiborne replied. Real strength doesn't need an audience. That night, Ethan lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought about Cross, how she moved through the bay with purpose, but without drawing attention. How she taught younger techs with patience. How she checked and double-checked every detail, not for glory, but because it mattered. And he thought about his own behavior, the cheap jokes, the need for approval, the way he'd tried to climb over others to feel taller. Humility, he realized, wasn't about thinking less of yourself. It was about seeing yourself clearly, flaws and all. It was about knowing when you were wrong and having the courage to admit it. The next morning, Ethan approached Cross at the diagnostic station. His heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. Lieutenant, he began, voice low, respectful, I owe you an apology for what I said, for how I acted. I was out of line. Cross looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no anger there, no disdain, just quiet acknowledgement. Everyone makes mistakes, Ward, she said. It's what you do after that shows who you really are. Ethan nodded, feeling the knot inside him loosen just a little. And from that day, things changed. He watched, he listened, he learned. He stopped trying to be the loudest voice in the room. He started trying to be the best teammate, the best airman, the best man he could be. Because humility had shown him what arrogance never could. That true strength doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be. In the days and weeks that followed, Ethan Ward became a quieter man, not silent, but thoughtful. The loud jokes, the constant need to prove himself with words, faded like echoes of another life. He found himself watching more than speaking, learning in ways he hadn't before, and at the center of it all was Lieutenant Natalie Cross. Natalie, Ghosthawk, didn't change. She still moved through the maintenance bay with the same quiet precision, clipboard in hand, her eyes sharp and focused. She still rolled up her sleeves, exposing the scars that had once made Ethan so uncomfortable. But now when he looked at them, he didn't see weakness. He didn't see something to mock. He saw a history he'd never know, and a strength he could only hope to understand one day. What struck him most was how ordinary she seemed, despite what he now knew about her. She didn't command rooms with loud speeches or demand attention with grand gestures. She taught the youngest technicians how to recalibrate systems with patience. She stayed late to help troubleshoot when no one else could figure out a problem. She ate in the mess hall with the rest of the crew, offering no airs or entitlement. And the more Ethan watched, the more he understood. This was her choice. Natalie Cross could have left. She could have written her own ticket to any command, any office, any place in the world she wanted, but she chose to stay here. Chose the work no one celebrated. The long hours, the grease-stained uniforms, the hum of machinery instead of applause. Because real strength didn't need the spotlight. It was in the way she stepped up quietly when something needed to be done. In the way she listened more than she spoke. In the way her presence made others want to do better. Not because she ordered it, but because she inspired it. The base began to change too. People noticed. The ones who'd barely seen her before now watched her with newfound respect. Senior officers stopped by the bay more often, offering nods or quiet words of acknowledgement. The younger airmen, like Ethan, tried harder, worked cleaner, listened more. Ethan found himself alongside her more and more. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn. She didn't talk about Iron Veil. She didn't talk about what she'd done. But in the way she carried herself, in the way she approached every task, the lessons were there for anyone willing to see. One evening, as the sun set over Ravenfield, casting the hangar in golden shadow, Ethan stood beside Master Sergeant Claiborne, watching Natalie finish up her shift. "She doesn't say much," Ethan said quietly. Claiborne nodded. "Orn doesn't have to. The ones who've seen the worst usually don't." And Ethan understood. Because real strength wasn't loud. It wasn't in medals or speeches or the need for recognition. Real strength was quiet. It was steady. It was in the hands that kept planes flying, in the eyes that saw what needed to be done and did it without fanfare. It was in people like Natalie Cross, who carried their burdens in silence, and in doing so, lifted everyone around them. I used to believe strength was something loud. I thought it came with applause, medals, or headlines. But Lieutenant Natalie Cross, or Ghosthawk, as some will forever know her, taught me otherwise. Strength, real strength, speaks softly. It doesn't boast. It doesn't demand to be seen. It shows up in the quiet hours, in steady hands fixing what's broken, in choices made not for recognition, but because they're right. Her scars, in the ones I once mocked, aren't marks of weakness. They're silent proof of battles fought so others wouldn't have to. They're reminders of the price paid for our safety, our freedom, our peace. And maybe that's a lesson we could all bring into our lives today. In this world where voices are often raised just to be heard, where so much value is placed on who gets the spotlight, perhaps we should look again at those who work in the shadows. The neighbor who checks on the elderly down the street. The nurse who stays the extra shift without complaint. The veteran who volunteers quietly at the community center. Maybe you've known someone like that. Someone whose quiet strength changed your life. Whose scars, visible or not, tell a story of sacrifice and service. I'd love to hear about them. Share your story in the comments. Let's honor those heroes who don't seek praise, but deserve it all the same. And here's something to think about. What other silent heroes walk among us today, unnoticed? Are we paying enough attention? Could there be a Ghosthawk in your community, living quietly, carrying burdens we can't see? Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your questions, your experiences. Let's start a conversation, because stories like this one remind us what matters most. If this touched your heart, if it made you see things in a new light, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more true, touching stories of hidden valor. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, for reflecting. The world could use more of that, more listening, more understanding, more respect for those who serve without needing to be seen.